this get so far out of whack? They forgot about precession. Imagine a child's spinning top, spinning very, very fast in one direction, while its axis is turning very slowly in the other direction. That's what our Earth is doing. Earth is a wandering star too. Our orientation to the rest of the zodiac slips backward by 1 degree every 72 years. For the first couple of 100 years, you wouldn't notice much of a difference. But after 1,000 years and more, the discrepancy becomes too great to ignore. Unless you're really stubborn and you stick to your tables because that's what you have to work with, and never try to reconcile it with what's actually going on in the sky. And that apparently is what the newbie European and later American astrologers did. That mistake, that failure to make a little tweak in the math every 72 years got perpetuated and increased down to the present day. So when astrology started getting really popular in the 1960s and 70s, most people had no idea that the planetary positions in their own horoscopes were actually 23 degrees behind where the table said they should be. And for the generation born in or near the 21st century, their calculations are off by 24 degrees. The wandering stars wandered farther than you bargained for. Small wonder that when I started trying to learn it at age 15, and this is my very first astrology book, I still have it, I struggled with the science for years. But even a busted clock is right twice a day. As for example, when I correctly guessed that one of my friends was a Virgo without even casting her chart. She was amazed. "How did you know?" I said, "Your cheekbones are very symmetrical." But I could never really get astrology to make sense for me until I switched over to the Hindu system, also known as Vedic astrology, which had not been destroyed in the Dark Ages. Their math was still intact. They use the sidereal zodiac. Sidereal means of the stars, meaning the planets are where they are against the backdrop of the actual sky. It's not connected to the equinox here on Earth. This reckoning is not about earthly time, it's about cosmic time. The equinox is the equinox, that is still March 21st, when the sun crosses the equator and continues north. But the sun does not actually enter Aries until 3 weeks later. The sidereal zodiac starts on April 14th or 15th. So, when you find out that your planetary placements and your rising sign move backwards so that most of them are actually a sign behind where you thought they were, what do? Despite the story you've been telling yourself your whole life, you might be surprised how much more sense this makes. Here is where we get to pull up a famous person chart to compare them. But first, I have to introduce you to a concept that's unique to Vedic astrology, which places more emphasis on what planets rule. When you're looking at a Vedic chart, one of the first things I look for is whether there are any Raja yogas, because these show you where a person has great confidence in what they're doing. Raja means king. As its name indicates, it's a combination for fame and accomplishments. You find them by looking for the rulers of certain houses in the chart, not their signs, because the rulers of signs will always stay the same. while the houses rotate around the signs. The sun always rules Leo. The moon always rules Cancer. Mercury rules Gemini and Virgo. Venus rules Taurus and Libra. Mars rules Aries and Scorpio. Jupiter rules Pisces and Sagittarius. And Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius. Notice these are the classical rulerships of the planets you can actually see. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto don't rule anything in a Vedic chart. To find a Raja Yoga, you will want to look for the ruling planets of the houses of initiative, which are the 1st, 4th, 7th, and 10th. These are like pillars of strength in any chart. And see whether any of them land in the houses of luck, 1st, 5th, and 9th, or vice versa. Either way will work. Notice that the 1st house counts for both, which means if you don't have the rising sign correct, this isn't going to work. Your own efforts and divine grace have to intersect for good stuff to happen. Now let's go to our famous person chart. I have chosen someone everybody loves, Robin Williams, who I understand is back in the news these days. There is a new documentary about him that's just coming out. Now this looks a lot more spare than what you're used to seeing in a Western chart, but you can still tell a lot just from this much. Find the Raja Yogas. What's the planet of comedy? Mercury. Mercury rules a house of luck, the 9th, and lands in a house of initiative, the 10th. Second Raja Yoga, take a look at Mars. Rules a house of initiative, the 7th, landing in a house of luck, the 9th. So here's the formula working in the other direction. Loves a challenge, completely fearless, at least on stage and screen. Also made him very fortunate in his co-stars because the 7th house rules partnerships. Third Raja Yoga. The moon rules a house of initiative, lands in a house of luck, the 5th. Very fortunate for someone in the public eye and for making money doing what he loves, because 10th is career, 5th is creating what you love. His work was play. Even better, look at what's joined it. The North Node eclipse point, and it's tight, 3 degrees apart. Where did that completely wacky, outside the box thinking come from? Here's where. Master of improv. When an eclipse point joins a Raja Yoga planet, it too becomes a Raja Yoga. So there is a 4th Raja Yoga that is a special case. Another nice thing is that Mercury is far enough away from the sun that his comedy didn't turn sarcastic. It was never mean-spirited. Even when he pushed the envelope with off-color jokes, he was rarely, if ever, crass. Now, how many comedians can you say that about? So now you're wondering, if he had all that going for him, why did he end up killing himself? Well, there's the Libra rising sign, and Libras are tricky because everything in life is flipped upside down for them. The ruling planet is Venus, which also rules what other house? The 8th, the house of hidden fears. All that stuff you wrestle with in the dark of night. And where did Venus land for him? Right next to the other eclipse point. Super tight conjunction, less than 2 degrees apart. The South Node of the eclipses is the shadow that gives people a disgust with the world. He was searching for perfection and beauty, but perfection can't be found in these things of this world. The planet of happiness joined the planet of disgust, is one of the markers for depression, and mastering that internal conflict was always going to be difficult for him, especially living in the public eye with this always hidden under the surface. Eventually, the cognitive dissonance just got to be too much to bear. Now, watch what happens if you look at Robin Williams' chart according to Western astrology calculations. Look at these numbers and roll them forward by 23 degrees to make the equivalent of a Western chart. Only 2 planets are still in the same signs, Sun and Saturn, but every other planet is completely in a different sign, and the ascendant has now become Scorpio, which completely changes the house rulerships. Just one sign forward does this. Do you see the same Raja Yogas with Mercury, Mars, and the Moon? Start with the planet of comedy. Does Mercury still form a Raja Yoga? Yes, it still lands in the 8th, but does it still rule the 9th? No. For Scorpio, it rules the 8th, much less auspicious. Next, Mars. Still a Raja Yoga? Actually, yes, but from a different direction this time. Still lands in, it is the ruler of the 1st, landing in the 9th. But watch out, it's too close to the sun, which makes Mars even more hot-tempered than usual. And by moving forward to Cancer, Mars becomes debilitated. Mars always wants to have a sword in his hand, but in Cancer, all he's got to work with is a pillow. Apt to be on the losing side of most fights, which leads to an enormous possibility for resentment and vengeance, not knowing what is an appropriate use of force. And then the Moon. Still a Raja Yoga or not? She still rules the 9th, house of luck, but does she land in a house of initiative? No, lands in the 5th, another house of luck. This is actually a different kind of yoga that gives wealth. You would think that might be great too, but with the North Node also there, planet of extremes, explosions, and deceptions, strong possibility of the gains being ill-gotten or unearned, and making cockamamie decisions with that money. Might lose it as fast as he gets it. So you've gone from 4 Raja Yogas down to 1. And the planet that predisposed him to suicide, Venus joined the South Node, is in even worse shape here. Now, she's joined Saturn as well, which is a cruel planet for Scorpios, and she's debilitated in the sign of Virgo. She rules the 7th house for a Scorpio chart, so she rules the marriage partner. Odds are that if he ever got married, maybe he wouldn't be depressed, but his wife would. This is a completely different life. Do you see how the Vedic chart, calculated by Sidereal Time, makes much more sense, knowing what we know about Robin Williams? And even though he wasn't born on an eclipse, how much more is explained when you factor in the eclipse points? Which chart would you rather have? Yes, he came to a tragic end, but what a legacy of work he left behind. So that covers the 3 things I mentioned at the top of the hour. We went in the Wayback Machine with Mr. Peabody to the start of astrological science. We learned how the wandering stars ended up being miscalculated, and we learned how to repair a horoscope by switching over to sidereal time. So if you're still with me, you've earned a bonus, how to handle a bad Saturn transit. Now you've seen what a big difference sidereal time makes, so you're going to want to get a couple of apps to keep you on track. Where are the apps? Do I still have the apps? I didn't put them up there. All right, I'm gonna pull up the apps. There we go. Okay, you see those? Yes, because retrogrades still happen when they happen. That part is still accurate, but you're going to want to pay closer attention to when the planets change signs. I recommend Ephemeris by Clifford Ribodeau, which will give you ballpark figures for most of the planets, but because the moon moves fastest, you will need a special app to pinpoint just her movements. Hora Watch by Vok Sounds is your go-to for that. Now, I already mentioned that the sun changes signs 3 weeks later than you think. For most of the other planets, the ingresses are even weirder by sidereal time. Take Saturn, for example. I'm gonna get this out of here. Close the app page, okay? Take Saturn, for example. The Western astrologers have been telling you that Saturn has been in Capricorn since the end of 2017, going through to the end of this year. But according to sidereal reckoning, Saturn was in Sagittarius all that time. In fact, Saturn in Sagittarius began at the beginning of 2017, just as the Trump administration was beginning. And guess what's the rising sign of the chart of the United States? Sagittarius. Enormous pressure on our country's very identity, because Saturn brings pressure more than anything else. He will either change things or break them. It has made us question who we are, what kind of a country do we want to be? What vision of ourselves are we going to commit to? Inclusiveness or white supremacy? Socialism or social Darwinism? Which ideology is going to break first? Saturn didn't enter Capricorn until the end of January of this year. And what happened in that very week? The first COVID cases were reported in this country. What has happened since? Extreme restrictions upon our ability to go anywhere. Contraction of the economy, the worst in 90 years. Capricorn is the second house of the United States chart, one of the wealth houses. Guess what else the second house rules? A person's face. We've all had to cover our faces. And it rules the speaking voice. We can't talk to each other in person. We've got almost another 2 years of Saturn in Capricorn, and it may well take that long for us to see our way clear of the pandemic or to find a vaccine that actually works. But on a more personal level, that Saturn in Sagittarius was my second Saturn return, which is what happens when Saturn comes back around to where it was in your chart when you were born. Most people have heard of a Saturn return. It happens every 29.5 years. So if you live to be 90, you'll experience this 3 times in your life. If you do Saturn returns right, the first one, as you're turning 30, is when you stop fooling around and get serious about your life. The second one, as you approach 60, is when you want to reach a culmination of your working life and start planning for how you're going to live life as an elder. or figure out what you're going to leave for next generations so they don't have to face the same difficulties you did, or at least handle those difficulties more intelligently. And then you use the next 30 years following the second Saturn return to make sure you've imparted whatever wisdom you've got. The final Saturn return, ideally, is when you can look back on your life and be at peace, knowing it was a job well done. But my second Saturn return had a couple of extra themes on top of that I didn't expect, and I would have preferred not to have to deal with. You see how my